Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm thinking of an incident that happened about 10 years ago when I started my journey with logotherapy. I walked into the first orientation. It was in the home of one of my important mentors, Dr. Tani Burton, who herself was a student of Dr. Viktor Frankl. And we were all sitting there, and she said how exhilarated she felt that we were all going to experience a journey towards life meaning, and how we were going to learn the skills to tune into the meaning of the moment. Now, I thought to myself, what is that anyway? A few years back, I had read Dr. Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is considered one of the books you should read before you die. Sounds a little bit morbid, but suffice it to say, it's been translated into 80 languages, and it's one of those books. I'd read about meaning before, but it's hard to define. It's hard to put your finger on what that is, because meaning is a phenomenological term. And phenomenological means you know it when you experience it. This is what sets logotherapy apart from so many other fields of therapy. My name is Tani Burton. I'm from the United States. I've been in Israel for 18 years, but originally I'm from New York, which I guess is just east of the United States. And I have a master's degree in clinical social work, as well as rabbinic ordination. And I am a clinical diplomate in logotherapy. And I'm here tonight to discuss with you, or whenever you're watching this, what a game changer logotherapy is. Let's talk about the purpose of this webinar. I'm going to introduce to you the concept of logotherapy, even though I know that many people are already familiar with what it is. I'm going to give you a brief overview of logotherapeutic concepts that I'll go into in much greater detail in the upcoming course. And finally, I'm going to extend an invitation to you to join me starting on May 2nd for Logotherapy Level 1. Let's get on with it. In order to understand logotherapy, we also have to understand who was it who conceptualized logotherapy and brought it into the world. And that, of course, is Dr. Viktor Frankl. Dr. Viktor Frankl lived a very extraordinary life. We know Dr. Frankl from the fact that he was imprisoned in 5 concentration camps, and then brought the idea that the primary motivator for human behavior is the search for meaning, which we assume was the fruit of his experiences in the concentration camps. But in fact, he had a very illustrious career in the scientific and medical community for 20 years before being shipped off with his family to the camps. Dr. Frankl was a psychiatrist and neurologist at Vienna's Polyclinic. That was after the war. Prior to the war, he was the head of the suicide prevention pavilion at Stanhof Psychiatric Institute in Vienna, which is an institution that still exists. He was imprisoned actually in 5 concentration camps over 3 years during the Holocaust. And he is the father of logotherapy and existential analysis. After his experiences in the war, he directed the Vienna Polyclinic of Neurology until 1971, after which point he continued to publish and teach and travel the world, carrying his message of meaning wherever he could teach it. 39 books published in 40 languages. He received a staggering 29 honorary doctoral degrees, and he became a visiting professor and lecturer worldwide, even at a very advanced age, appearing on television, in print, and raising up a generation, and then some, of practitioners who place meaning at the center. Let's have a brief overview of logotherapeutic concepts. Here's a quote from Dr. Frankl. "There is no psychotherapy without a theory of man and a philosophy of life underlying it." In this summary statement, we see three components. We see psychotherapy, we see theory of man, and we see philosophy of life. The idea being that every single one of the major psychotherapeutic approaches or divisions of psychology possess these three characteristics. They have a way that they look at human beings. They have a systematic structure within which they treat human beings. And they also have a philosophy towards life itself. This is a quote from Viktor Frankl from his book, The Doctor and the Soul, which, interestingly enough, was brought in to Auschwitz in manuscript form, sewn into the coat of Dr. Frankl. He lost this almost immediately upon entry. And so the book, The Doctor and the Soul, was then reconstructed many years later. Taking this statement, Elizabeth Lucas, who is one of Frankl's students and a very prominent member of the logotherapeutic community, she wrote a logotherapy textbook in which she described these three elements that serve as what we call the three pillars of logotherapy. And they are, again, the theory of man, the psychotherapy, and the philosophy of life, the three components. Let's proceed in conceptual order here. There's an anthropological element of logotherapy, and then there's a psychotherapeutic element of logotherapy and a philosophy of life. The anthropological aspect of logotherapy can be termed freedom of will. It's a view of the human being himself. Frankl said that there is no psychotherapy without a theory of man and a philosophy of life underlying it. So freedom of will is the theory of man component of logotherapy. That's the anthropological aspect. And according to this theory, very important belief that logotherapists carry with them, that human beings are free from determinism. They are not fated. It doesn't mean that they're free from conditions, as we will emphasize several times, but that they can choose how they respond to any given circumstance, no matter how horrible. And that's something that Frankl's experiences in the camps proved. It was a theory he carried into the camps to begin with. The will to meaning corresponds to the psychotherapeutic element of logotherapy, which is what our course is going to emphasize. It's the motivational theory of logotherapy. Each form of psychotherapy has a motivational theory. Frankl contrasted his to the motivational theories of Freud and Adler. Freud's being the will to pleasure, Adler's being the will to power. Frankl felt that the true central motivational force in human beings is the quest for meaning in life. Now, the will to meaning has two different aspects to it. It has an internal aspect and it has an external aspect. What we mean is, the internal aspect of the will to meaning is the longing for meaning that is inherent in all human beings. And the external aspect of the will to meaning is the endowment, the ability of a person to detect meaning in his or her situation and to discover what his or her circumstances offer in terms of meaning. The idea being, as we will see in the next piece, philosophy, meaning in life, that life is unconditionally meaningful. So we assume that from the very fact that meaning exists, we have been endowed with some type of mechanism to find it in life. And that's what we're going to help our clients do. So meaning in life, again, is the idea that life is unconditionally meaningful under all circumstances. As Lucas has said, it cannot vanish under any circumstance, even though it can be withdrawn from human comprehension. And when we have clients who come in and they're distressed, one way to understand this is that the meaning of life has vanished from their field of vision, as it were. And it's our job to retune them into the inherent meaning that is present at all times. Now, when we say freedom of will, freedom to choose one's response to any circumstance, that means that he's free to choose his response to things that happen from the outside and from the inside. For example, social pressures. Let me show you a very powerful photograph. This is a Nazi rally in 1936. As you can see, almost everyone here is caught up in the exuberance of the moment, the rising Nazi party, the sense of incredible unity and conformity. Everybody's got their hand raised in the Sieg Heil gesture. And then within the circle, we can see one man with a very different reaction. That despite whatever is going around or on around him, he can choose his own way. This man that's pictured here is somebody by the name of August Landmesser, who has a very tragic but very heroic story about how he chose to live according to the dictates of his conscience, despite all of the pressure to do the opposite. And here's the quote from Frankl: "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude towards any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." This was a very hard lesson learned by people who went through the utmost privation in the camps, where absolutely everything, their lives, their families, their possessions, their clothes, their futures had essentially been taken away from them. Even their ability to decide whether they should live or die had been stolen from them. But there was one thing that could not be taken away, and that is what is stated in this quote: the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And this basic principle is what guides us when we help people who are suffering. They might be suffering for physical reasons. They might be suffering for emotional, affective, psychological reasons. But the ability to respond to circumstances, however unavoidable, remains intact under all circumstances. And not only that, it's this very fact that makes the challenges and the difficulties of life an incredible opportunity for victory. The concept of the freedom of the will is defined by a human being's capacity to act in freedom. And there's times when we have no choices, really, other than to take an attitude towards our conditions. Now, the will to meaning, which again is the motivational theory of logotherapy, it can be defined as the basic striving of man to find and fulfill meaning and purpose. It stands in contradiction to a very prevalent idea that ran through the scientific and psychological community at the time and continues to do so to this very day. And that's the idea of reductionism. There's a tendency to reduce everything to a psychological or biological function as a way of explaining and ultimately researching human thought and behavior. This is a perspective that does not see any dimension of human beings higher than the psychological. And according to Frankl, exactly that point is what robs the human being of his humanness. Because to be human is to be directed at something higher than oneself. Values, meanings, a concept of a purpose in life, a reason for our existence. Plants and animals and humans all have a biological dimension. Animals and humans have both a biological and a psychological dimension. But only the human being has a noetic dimension, a spiritual dimension. This is a dimension that surpasses all the other ones, and the will to meaning is rooted in it. We'll get into the concept of dimensional ontology and how we see the human being as a holistic creation more in depth. But I wanted to point out the following thing. Let's take a look at what's been going on in psychology since let's say since its inception as a specific field within the scientific arena. As you can see from this psychology timeline, very nice graphic, not mine. Psychology as we know it is something that happened at the end of the 19th century. Before this point, free speculation was made about human thought, behavior, and temperament. And it moved after remaining in this place for centuries upon centuries in the context of the German academic world of the 19th century, which was very scientifically oriented. Psychology moves into that realm as sort of its birth cradle with the ideas of Wilhelm Wundt, who brought us the concept of structuralism. This gave way to other theories, other forms. When we get to the beginning of the 20th century, we're already in the area of psychoanalysis and behavioral theory as well, the concept of behaviorism. We're trying to understand how people think from their behavior by reasoning backwards from their behavior. Or we're trying to explain behavior by linking it back to thought. Now, this goes back and forth for a while. The first half of the 20th century was dominated by a basic positivist idea that nothing except that which is observable through scientific method could be said to really exist in reality. So there was a lot that was being left aside by psychology in its scientific habitat. At some point, like at the beginning of the 50s, the psychological community reached backwards towards its roots in behaviorism, and behaviorism or behavioral theory became prominent, very much as a rejection of Freudian ideas. but not necessarily replacing the basic reductionism of the psychotherapeutic approaches that existed before it. So we move from there into something else. In 1957, Carl Rogers published an article on the 6 conditions that were necessary for psychotherapy, for change in psychotherapy. In 1972, Rogers concluded that these basic conditions, which he then sort of reduxed into genuineness, authenticity, empathic understanding, unconditional positive regard, he was able to demonstrate pretty clearly that no matter what treatment approach you take, as long as it includes these elements, which are so critical for creating the right relationship between therapist and client, and for creating a space in which a person can grow and can express themselves and can unburden themselves and can share themselves. It pretty much didn't matter which treatment approach you took. And that was what humanistic theory brought into the world. Royo May, Rogers, Abraham Maslow, a rediscovery and a re-exploration of the inner world of the client, their feelings, their dreams, their aspirations, their desire for self-actualization to become all that they can become. In fact, Abraham Maslow lists that, if you look at the hierarchy of human needs, lists the idea of self-actualization, becoming everything that you can be at the top of human needs. And for the most part, the existentialists and Frankl himself and the field of logotherapy doesn't really disagree with that idea that we need to get away from this constant subjecting of human experience to the rigors of scientific research, because we lose something in the process. But Frankl did not consider self-actualization to be the top of the pyramid. He said, in fact, it's not even something to strive for, because self-actualization, or rather actualization, is something that happens when a person engages in meaning, is when they're plugged into the meaning of life. So, as you can see, now we go then into the later 60s into cognitive theory, which eventually is married to behavioral theory. So we get cognitive behavioral theory, social learning, biological psychology, which is also known as behavioral neuroscience, and cognitive neuroscience. So you can see that for the most part, there's been a very scientific approach to psychology with a few exceptions. So the idea of the importance of psychology as a validatable clinical approach versus an emphasis on consciousness and the subjective experience, in a sense, the mystery, a magic of what it means to be human and to be called towards meaning, towards some value in life. There's been this kind of back and forth. I think you're probably getting a pretty good idea of where logotherapy sits in this equation. Now, reductionism offers a very substantial benefit insofar as it allows human behavior and thought to be reduced to isolated variables that allow us to identify causes of behavior. It can be studied. And once we can identify these causes of behavior, we can apply very exact treatments to it. So for example, if we take a biochemical approach to mental health, emotional health, we will be very concerned about neurochemical balances and how we can influence that with medication. Behaviorism is a field in which behavior is reduced to stimulus and response, and ultimately a more complex behavior, links of stimulus and response links. Behavioral neurology, which is a much more modern approach, behavior is reduced to genetics and also neurochemicals to biological aspects of the person. Structuralism, which is Wundt's contribution, reduced conscious experience to component parts such as images, sensations, and feelings. It was disproven pretty early on. Cognitive psychology analyzes human behavior to machines. Frankl once said something very interesting, that man was created in the image of God, and then he recreated himself in the image of his own creation, which is the machine. Understanding the link between thoughts and feelings and how cognitive assessments and distorted cognitive assessments produce negative affective states. Psychodynamic theory, which is rooted in psychoanalysis, essentially reduces the influence of human beings to their early experiences and the personality of human beings to the basic id, ego, superego structure. Now, if I'm just going to skip ahead a few slides here, look at the difference, how Frankl conceived human beings as opposed to Freud. Freud dealt almost exclusively with the psychological aspect of human beings. If you'll notice, I drew this diagram just kind of to demonstrate these ideas. Only the psychological aspect of a person is addressed. The totality of the human being is reduced to this model in psychoanalysis. And there are three characters in Freud's model of the personality. There's the id, the raw drives that demand satisfaction. You have the superego, the internal policeman or father figure or the priest, the amalgam of all the moral messages and didactic messages that a person's picked up from society and from their parents, which is there to subdue and repress the id through guilt and allows the person to function normally within the context of society. So according to that which is deemed acceptable behavior in society. We're in trouble because when society changes, and we would expect that there would be less or different pressures on the id, and it would be much harder, or rather it would be a lot easier to be a pretty horrible human being because it doesn't really bother anybody else. And then, of course, there's the guy trapped in between the id and the superego, which is the ego, the I, the person himself, who's trapped between and has to mitigate between these two forces and broker an agreement that satisfies the id demand in a way that is acceptable to the superego. So, for example, instead of bombing your employer's home, you might schedule a meeting with him or her to request a raise or more respect. I have used closed lines in Freud's model because Freud sees the human personality as a closed system. All this stuff is going on the intrapsychic level between this person and themselves. And therefore, meaning, morals, and values don't exist in the objective sense, nor do they come from a realm beyond the self. It's just a playback of the superego's moral tape library, the superego's MP3 files. Got to bring ourselves up to date a little bit. And Freud's model does not allow for there being a transcending conscience or any objective meaning or morality. It rather, the right and the wrong depend on the cultural or social context in which a person finds himself. And a person's ability to manifest right and good is essentially only a function of the repression of their animal-like id drives. That's how psychoanalysis defines conscience. And I dare say, I think we've absorbed these ideas and have gotten them into the muscle. I think we think these things on a subconscious level. Freud was massively influential in terms of the way we think today. We don't even know to trace it back to some finite point in time. We think this is just received wisdom over the ages. But if you look at Frankl's model, it's very different. It's open. And that's what I use the broken lines for. It's open. We're dealing both with we're dealing holistically with the somatic, the biological, the psychic, the psychological, and the spiritual, the noetic aspects of human existence. Now, when I spoke of dimensional ontology, that's a model that Frankl has, but I'm going to simplify it here in this diagram. Here is the totality of the human being. A biological, a psychological, and a spiritual level. When I say spiritual, I don't mean necessarily religious spiritual, but in terms of a person having the human spirit. And I drew arrows in here to indicate the direction that each one of these levels takes us. Biological things always take us downward, right? If a person's sick, if they're injured, they're down. It's like gravity. It just pulls us down. In fact, all the exercise that we do, pretty much, getting ourselves in shape usually involves defying gravity or working against the resistance offered by gravity. The psychological and social levels of a person, I drew with these circular arrows to show that a person who lives in their head and is preoccupied with their depression, with their anxiety, with their fears, with their OCD, with their social phobias, with their personality flaws, as we might say, is kind of just going round and round and round in their own head. Again, both the lower and the middle levels are denoted with solid lines to show you that they are essentially closed systems. What goes on in the body is what goes on in the body. What goes on in your head is what goes on in your head. If you're not connected to the world outside of you, you still have plenty of stuff to do. Mind and body influence each other. That's one very important advancement that we have come upon in the 20th century, is the mind-body connection. I drew a double-sided arrow here where it says influence to show you that how a person feels physically will certainly influence how they feel emotionally, and vice versa. When people are anxious or depressed, they have very differing levels of energy than they do when they are happy, healthy, and functional. When a person is sick or exhausted, that's going to have an impact on the way they feel, on the affective level. Now, most therapeutic approaches, if we go back to our diagram here, deal with the first two levels of human existence, with the biological level and the psychological level of human existence. It means to say that the roof for those approaches is at the psychological level. If you are a reductionist scientific type, it's very difficult to imagine that there is a spiritual realm because it's not observable and provable through scientific method. So if you're going to be true to your guns, I don't think that's actually an expression. If you're going to be true to your theories, if you're going to stick to your guns, then even if you know deep down inside that there is a transcendent aspect to humanity, that there are values that are objective, that we are called, that there is a magic and a mystery to our existence, you're not really going to be able to operate that way professionally. So they stop at that point. I call this realm underneath the middle line there the realm of strategies, because whether a person is hurting physically or psychologically, the question is always, how do we get out of this problem? How do we solve that problem? It's the problem zone. And this is exactly what happens in standard therapies. A person comes in, what do we want to identify first and foremost? The presenting problem. It's problem-centered therapy. Now, when it came to humanistic theory, that was person-centered. which meant that the problem was obviously something that we had to deal with, but we're still trying to consider that in the totality of the human being. If you look above the broken line, you see something very different. You see a realm of the human being that is not a closed system, that is open and receptive to values and meaning, reaches upwards towards those things in a quest to determine what is the purpose of our existence. What are we doing here? What am I supposed to do in this world? What's the meaning of my life? What's the meaning of my suffering? That's the spiritual level. This is where self-development happens, because we are not trapped within ourselves anymore. If you look below that line, most of our problems are lifelong problems. Most of our psychological, our personality flaws, our physical limitations are the ingredients of lifelong experiences. Biology says that all of our expressions are related to biological phenomena, whereas psychology says that all our expressions are related to psychological concerns. That's what makes level 3 the highest dimension. Not that it supersedes or replaces the other ones. Well, it does supersede it. It doesn't replace it, though. In order to really help a human being, you have to consider all 3 levels. But it's the highest dimension in the sense that it is the most inclusive of all others. Meaning to say that when I have an experience of meaning, when I have a sense of purpose in my life, I can bear my problems. My problems become frustrations to meaning, that because I am oriented in the direction of meaning, I'm going to break past my limitations. So, for example, you'll find people who, when they fall in love, a lot of their troubles disappear. And even if they were not feeling physically well, all of a sudden things change. Because love is one of those things that is transcendent. It is a basic premise of logotherapy that to be human is to be directed towards something else. So that's the realm of meaning. That's the purpose zone as opposed to the problem zone. There, we're not looking for strategies. We're not looking for techniques. We're trying to answer the question, why? Why is my life this way? Why have things been set up like this? Why do I have these challenges? What's the meaning of my suffering? What am I here to do? Why am I here? And if you look at the contrast between why and how, we see just how powerful the spiritual dimension is, and just why it is such a game changer when that becomes your focus as a practitioner. Frankl was very fond of quoting Nietzsche, who said that he who has a strong enough why, meaning a reason for existence, can withstand any how, any adverse condition, anything that gets in his way, anything that requires strategies to get around it. If I know why I'm doing it, I can get there. Now, that's not to say that level 3 is all we talk about. Logotherapy can be both a specific and a non-specific therapy. When it comes to physical problems, logotherapy is a non-specific therapy. And that's true also of psychological problems, a non-specific therapy. Because again, the ability to tune into the meaning of every moment has some call to meaning that demands from us that we make the right choice, take right action in that moment. If a person breaks their leg, it's not the right thing at that moment in time to discuss, the existential message that's in it. You simply have to bring them to the hospital, get the leg set, get the bone set, cast it, and get them safer. And that's true of somebody who's decompensating on the psychological level. person's having a manic episode, psychotic episode. That's not the time to discuss the meaning of life. That's the time to administer medications. That's the time to try to get insight, try to develop cognitive strategies to help them with their own distorted perceptions of things, to be less miserable. In that case, logotherapy is still applicable because that's the meaning of those situations. So it allows a person flexibility to be supportive, and by the way, to use all the tools and techniques and insights and angles and perspectives that we've learned from all of these. Logotherapy is a therapy amongst other therapies. So it's not a rejection outright of everything. All of these approaches have contributed massively to what is becoming a unified field theory of human thought and behavior. And all of us coming to this presentation have been trained in a variety of these things. So there's every reason not to let any of them go, but just to remember that the focus on ultimate meaning in life puts them into a different type of perspective, because we are then employing them as tools to get a person to the point where they can start to consider why they are really here. Now, again, a human being is an open system. An open system reaches out towards meaning, much more than his or her psychology, much more than his body. Human beings always reaching beyond the self towards the world. A world, Frankl said, that is replete with other beings to encounter, other people, although we've had some UFO sightings lately, and meanings to fulfill. And that there's an objective meaning that exists beyond the self and can be detected by what we call the meaning organ, the antenna, the conscience. The conscience in logotherapy is like an antenna that helps a person reach out beyond the self towards what is really true, not simply towards pre-programmed moral messages, as other fields of psychology would have us think. That's the function of the human being as an open system. It's the older definition of conscience, where we know what's right and wrong in our guts. Our guts are much more accurate as instruments to determine meaning in the world. Now, of course, as you can imagine, the conscience is very often deadened through substance abuse, and meaning in life impossible to find by a person caught in the grip of addictions of drugs, alcohol, sex, gaming, and the internet. That's a problem. The inability to see meaning in life very often is through the deadening of our conscience by how we currently comport ourselves. And so there too, our job is to try to remove the obstacles and uncover the basic sense of mission in life. We have a basic premise in logotherapy that life is unconditionally meaningful, that it can't vanish under any circumstance, and it's the capacity to suffer that makes it possible to find meaning in the most difficult situations. There are 3 routes to meaning. I'm going to mention them very briefly here and get into them in incredible depth within the course. We have creative values, which relate to the things that we do in the world, the tasks that we perform, the things that we create, the things we produce, and what we contribute to the world. And then there's what we take from the world, our existential values, the encounters that we have with the world itself, with values, with other human beings, grasping another person in their uniqueness, experiencing beauty, love, art, music, values, a sense of the good. And finally, there's the attitudinal values. And this is really the most powerful part, and probably what we're going to be taking out in much of our work with people. Life is unconditionally meaningful, even in the face of the tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death, all three of which are unavoidable. The meaning in those situations is discovered by the way a person faces them. Logotherapy concerns itself with strengthening people's capacity to suffer. The ability to suffer the right way is second to none. It's an invaluable capacity. Frankl said the right kind of suffering, facing your fate without flinching, is the highest achievement that has been granted to man. And what happens through this type of suffering, through the right type? Tragedy is transformed into triumph. The challenges are transformed into accomplishments. Now, this is especially important for people working in the field of addictions. We come into contact with people whose capacity for right suffering is terribly limited. And their ability to see meaning in life's challenges is often very weak and met instead with addictive behaviors. So our job is to see the health underneath all of that, because we are always reaching for meaning. We are always reaching for the thing that gives our life its raison d'etre. Frankl was the head of the suicide prevention pavilion at Stanhof. And even before that, he ran a program in Vienna that was aimed at reducing suicide amongst high school students. And when he implemented his program, it was the first year in the city in who knew how long that students stopped committing suicide, that they actually had no suicides. And he was given an award for this. What is it about suicide? What was Frankl's thing about suicide? Now, in most treatment approaches, we look at suicidality as a problem. It is a problem, obviously. And so we take out all of our harm reduction tools in order to deal with it. We want to find out how proximate it is. We want to find out if they have a plan, if anybody else knows, what's the cause, the roots of it. And we try to construct a safety plan for them. And in dire cases, we break confidentiality in order to get them to safety. Frankl had a very different approach, which he was able to develop with confidence after many, many years doing this. He would ask his patients a simple question: why don't you commit suicide? It's kind of a question I think most of us would be terrified to ask somebody who's already told us about their suicidal ideation. But the point of that question is that the only answer to that question is because there's something that keeps me going, because there is a meaning that waits for me to fulfill it, because there's a reason to live. There is something that makes life worth living. And he wanted to tune them into that. That's logotherapy in a nutshell. Everybody suffers. Everybody has setbacks and challenges. So you always have a choice when you deal with people. You can either focus on that and make that sort of like their badge of honor. And Caroline Muss refers to that as victimology. Look, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have compassion for everyone. We have to. That's what's going to help them grow. But a better focus is, what is this problem preventing you from doing? Because it's that thing, that's what you're here for. And when you know what that is, all this other stuff kind of becomes worthwhile. I can bear this. Just like a parent who gets up in the middle of the night to pick up and soothe their crying baby, even though they're exhausted and they have to go to work the next day. What do they need this for? The answer is because their sense of responsibility towards this life supersedes all of that. It's much higher and bigger than their own exhaustion. So by way of analogy, that's true in life. So now I'm going to tell you what we're going to be doing in our upcoming logotherapy course. Here's 6 bullet points. They are going to be spread out over 8 sessions, each of which will occur on a Sunday and will be 3 hours long, with an hour for lecture, interactive group discussion and workshop exercises, plus readings and assignments to be completed at home, and an oral presentation at the end. We're going to be discussing the spiritual dimension with its theory of man, our anthropology of freedom of the will, the historical context in greater detail about the life of Viktor Frankl, the development of logotherapy, and its contrast to other approaches. And we will also be dealing with modern approaches as well as the approaches that Frankl compared logotherapy to in his time. By the way, I mean, somebody who passed away in 1997 saw the rest of the approaches as well. It's not like Viktor Frankl was stuck on psychoanalysis and individual psychology. We're going to move over into the principles of human existence, where we discuss the 3 pillars of logotherapy in greater detail. The concept of the meaning of the moment, that every single moment in a person's life has a call that is to be answered. The idea that we are all personally addressed by life, addressed to do something with our lives, and that each moment has an existential message for us, which is critical that we learn how to tune into that when we are frustrated by pain, suffering, and loss, and meaning is hard to see. We move into conscience and responsibility. Conscience, the meaning organ, it helps us tune into meaning. And responsibility, which has, I think, been rightly described as responsibility, meaning to say the ability to respond. Frankl said, man detects rather than selects his destiny. We discover in life what we are here to do. And it's then our choice to respond appropriately to that, to follow the obvious road signs that pop up for us, or to just sort of ignore them. And that's, again, a concept of being personally called by life. We're going to explore also the 3 pathways to meaning of creative, experiential, attitudinal, values, and then meaning despite unavoidable suffering, which is really the most powerful application of logotherapy. The idea, again, of freedom towards circumstances, our freedom to choose our way in any circumstance. It's not freedom from circumstances. And frankly, we don't want freedom from circumstances. We want to know the meaning of our circumstances and why they are custom made to allow us to grow into the people that we are supposed to be, and how to turn tragedy into triumph. This is all developed by the Viktor Frankl Institute of Logotherapy in Israel and accredited by the Viktor Frankl Institute of Logotherapy in Vienna, which is the main international accrediting body of logotherapy. When I did the course, we met for 3 years. It was very, very intense. It's been streamlined. It will not be that long for you to go not only through logotherapy level 1, but level 2, which is longer and includes the advanced and diplomate levels of logotherapy. It's a wonderful journey. And it's also a radical reorientation about how we look at life, how we look at people, and how we look at therapy. But it is a liberating reorientation. It gets us out of this constant and never-ending search for the next technique, the next continuing education credit, that feeling of therapeutic FOMO. I don't know if you feel it, but I go through that Every time I hear about a course that's opening up in this kind of therapy, with that kind of technique, for this kind of trauma treatment, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, it's just all passing me by, and what's going to happen? We're just going to all become irrelevant unless we just go from one class to the next. Sometimes I wonder if anybody does any therapy, or if they just do courses marketing therapy. Fortunately, I have to say, at least about myself, that like I'm still doing therapy, and I think you are too. And I think that, being liberated from the anxiety of what technique to apply now, and being brought back up, let's say, zooming out 10,000 feet so we can see the basic elements of what makes human life meaningful, and coming back and giving that gift to ourselves and the people around us and the people that we work with. It's a gift that I was given, and it's a gift that I want to give to you. So I'm very excited about this course. We start on May 2nd, and we will have 8 Sundays, at which point in time you will receive your first level certification, and you will gain entry into a wonderful worldwide community of practitioners who are advancing the idea and the cause of meaning in life and in the world. And that's going to have a very big impact for the good on society. I thank you for joining me for this presentation, and I look very much forward to growing together with you. If you want to continue this conversation, if you want to ask me about anything I've presented so far, please don't hesitate to contact me at the number that you see here. You can call me, you can WhatsApp me, and we'll set up a time to talk. There's my email address. Feel free to use it. And if you want to register for the course, there's the link. It'll take you to the registration page. You can pay by credit card, and we'll see you on May 2nd. I'm offering an early registration discount until April 25th, after which point the price goes up by $60. So get in there. I'm looking forward to seeing you. Thanks for joining me.